All right, let's get started here. Okay, so today we're going to talk about religion. Desperately hope my voice holds out. I've been feeling like I'm gonna lose my voice for the last couple of days. Just to add insults to injury this Easter. So hopefully taking honey-based lozenges like they're going out of style. So hopefully that keeps things working for the next hour and 20 minutes or so, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, I'm starting to feel better. I feel like I got hit by a freight truck, but I'm doing okay. You've heard it, the prof is giving you all A's just for showing up. I'm afraid that you've been had as an April Fool's joke. I wish. Okay, so we're gonna keep going talking about religion. I know it's been since last Tuesday, so it feels like it's modern and it's modernity. Religion will find itself pushed more and more to the margins until modernity gets rid of it altogether. A very old thesis, going back to the days of the Enlightenment and like Weber and Marx and all those cats. And we talked about the revised secularization thesis, which is where we ended off last Tuesday, which essentially says, okay, religion's not going to go away, but it's going to continue playing a smaller and smaller part in the world, especially as the world goes through differentiation. More social institutions split off from religion than at any time in the past, and religion becomes just one institution amongst many. No. Okay, so oh, right. And we were talking about I mentioned Tom Holland, who wrote great books on the histories of Islam and the histories of Christianity. The one on Islam is called In the Shadow of the Sword, and the one on Christianity is called Dominion. They're both really good books, and it's Tom Holland, but not Spider-Man Tom Holland, British historian Tom Holland. Okay, so one of the other kind of theories that has emerged to talk about religion, and this is a fairly major one. Again, a little bit better how religions survive, and especially especially one particular country, one old United States of America, where quite contrary to I think what has commonly been expected by sociologists. The United States is a very modern country, right? It is as modern, as any other country in the world, certainly in terms of economies and technologies. And yet, the United States has resisted the trends that we've seen in Europe, and remained quite religious. And it is an absolute outlier in terms of kind of Western developed nations in terms of its level of religiosity. So the US is a bit of an aberration. And that aberration demands a sort of explanation. And one of the explanations that has been proffered for why the United States has remained so religious while other parts of the world, especially the more modern ones, have become secular, is what's called the market model of religion. So, trying to understand, right, why secularization hasn't taken its predicted course. Some scholars, and especially here, one cat named Rodney Stark, and he's my favorite. He's sort of my, bless you, spirit animal in lots of ways. He is, right? A guy who, for lots of reasons, always essentially had no time for sort of the orthodoxies of sociology that were very disruptive. And one of them is the market theory of religion. So basically, what Stark, and he's written with a lot of other people like, Roger Fink and William Bainbridge were some of his favorite co-authors. What he basically said was that religion, we should think of it we should think of it more like a market, right? as something that has both supply and demand, right? And what Stark really kind of wants to understand, and what market theory is aimed at, is figuring out how religious groups, right? He calls them religious firms, right? Like, almost like firms, like a company, right? Religious firms generate demand for their products, right? So, in a sense, what Stark will say is that market theory shifts the way of thinking about religion from thinking about one, solely about kind of like supply side, and starts to think about the demand side, right? And specifically how firms generate demand, right? How they create products that are appealing. So, in this kind of metaphor, the services are demanded by people who desire religious activity, and religious denominations and groups, are all kind of products or brands offering different flavors of religion. Okay, so he says that there are basically a couple of situations that are possible when it comes to religion, and one of these is he calls a religious monopoly. And a religious monopoly exists when one religious body, right, or one religion gets special privileges from the state, right? So from the government, which prevents other religious bodies from selling their brand to consumers. So what Stark says is that most European countries, for a large part of their history, have essentially operated as monopolies, right? Where they had their chosen religion that, so whether it be, in France, it was Catholicism, in Italy, Catholicism, in the Netherlands, it was Calvinism, in England, it was Anglicanism or the Church of England. These were these religious monopolies, and no other religious firms were allowed to operate openly. And even if they were allowed to exist, they were often severely curtailed in what they could do. And you can think of following Henry VIII splitting off of the Church of England from Catholicism, church properties all over England were seized, right? It became illegal to, ordain new Catholic priests. All sorts of things like this happened to favor, one form of religion. So, what Stark says is in situations of a religious monopoly, what you actually get for the most part is demand for religion actually declines, right? And it kind of puts it this way, right? I'll talk about the opposite in a second. If you live in, like, say, a theoretical town somewhere, out in the world, and then only has one restaurant, right? Only one restaurant. Well, let's say Boston. This is probably just thinking small town Alberta. Whoop, pressure. Okay. Yeah. If you only have one restaurant, right, you're going to get a certain amount of demand, right? You're going to get some people who are like, hey, I don't mind Boston pizza. Let's go to Boston pizza. But then there's going to be a lot of people in that theoretical place that don't really care about Boston pizza, right? The menu there doesn't appeal to them. And what they're going to do is, instead of going out for dinner, right, they're going to stay home and cook their own food, right? They're not going to seek out restaurant food because there's nothing that appeals to them. So you're going to get a certain level of demand, but it's not going to be as high. Now, the opposite sort of happens when you get kind of religious pluralism, or what he would call it, a free market, right? A free religious market. And yeah, in countries that have open competition among religions, the market rewards those that are successfully meeting people's needs, and punishes those that don't, right? So basically, those that meet people's needs grow, those that don't meet people's needs shrink. The other thing, right, that happens is the more different brands of religion, kind of religious products are available, the more likely it is that you, as an individual, if you're interested in a religious product, are going to find one that appeals to you, right? If all you have, say, in Edmonton is the Catholic Church, right? It's not there. 1,000 different churches, or it can be for any religion, 1,000 different brands, right? One is like, super conservative and traditional, and the other is like Celebration Church, the one that's off 75th and Argyle, right, where it's basically like a mosh pit and rock concert in an old dealership, right? You could find something, on, at either of those or somewhere in between that appeals to what you are looking for in terms of a religious product. And what Stark says is because there are more, there's more supply and there's more people offering various kinds of religious products, religiosity will actually increase. Because more people will find a brand of religion that actually meets their needs, that appeals to them in some way. The other thing that happens is when you get a decline in religion, right? Suddenly the firms aren't meeting demand, you get a whole bunch of religious innovation, right? People attempt to solve this problem by creating new brands of religion, new programs, new approaches and strategies to kind of try and drive that, to reverse that trend. And, this is what Stark calls self-limiting secularization. Right? Basically, secularization is a self-limiting process. When demand, of religious products that are available, and they'll kind of check out religion, and there's going to be a decline in religion until religious innovators come in and kind of fill in that demand with new religious products to the interest in religion again. So secularization will only go so far, but eventually religions will respond and you'll get a kind of end point and a self-limit to that, right? Okay, so, and again, think of it like this. If we think of it in our restaurant metaphor, right? The town which had only allowed Boston pizza to be the official restaurant of the town, suddenly, a new mayor comes in and decides, we're going to open up, the town to a whole bunch of new restaurants and let anybody who wants a restaurant license come in and open a restaurant, any brand, and suddenly you have a fried chicken place and you have a Korean place and a Vietnamese restaurant and a Chinese restaurant and an Indian restaurant and any number of impressionable restaurants that open up in this place. And what will happen in that scenario is actually the consumption of restaurant food is going to increase, right? Because more people are going to be like, well, I'm hungry, I want to cook tonight. There's like 10 restaurants I could go to, and you'll find something that appeals to you. And so you're actually going to see, the more choice you have, the greater the demand is going to be as well. Okay? So you create more supply and more variety, and that actually drives demand in and of itself. So that's the sort of metaphor. Okay. Okay. I don't know why that is. Hang on, let me check something. That should help. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll see if that helps. Okay, what's the newest religion? In theory, a religion could have been born yesterday with some guy just being like, because usually they promise the moon or some equivalent thing. It doesn't typically work out that well. So, famous known religion, one that keeps up and is not a cult. Okay, I will answer that in a sec. But yeah, most new religions do die out in about 40 years. Okay. I would say probably Mormonism, to be honest, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is probably the newest kind of religion that went from new religious movement to kind of global religion, right? One that's actually expanding pretty quickly. I don't know I'd have to check the dates on Baha'i. But yeah, Mormonism is very, very new, and it's very, very, active in trying to spread itself, and it's become a sort of global religion.
It's probably the first world religion, right? Major world religion founded since, probably since Islam. Does Scientology predate Mormonism? No, Scientology is really new. Mormonism goes back into the 19th century. Yeah, so Baha'i and Mormonism are about the same age. Sorry, I lost. But Scientology is really recent. I think it comes out of like the 1970s or 80s, because it comes from a science fiction writer called L. Ron Hubbard. It's pretty odd religion. A lot of people don't even think it's really a religion. They think of it more as a tax shelter, but that's not for me to debate. Okay. All right, would I say Christianity still has a religious monopoly in the United States? So, Stark's argument about the United States is that because the U.S. has this clause, right, in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Okay. I don't know if that's true, and I'm not gonna debate the value of Mormonism. I will say, cult is not something that people really use in sociology of religion. We talk about new religious movements, not cults, particularly to get away from that pejorativeness. Okay, so yeah, sorry, this question about the United States. What Stark will say about the United States is the U.S. has this in its constitution, right? That there won't be the establishment of a particular religion. The government is not going to pass any laws establishing or a particular religion as the state religion or limiting, the exercise of religion, right? And what this has done is it's created a kind of free market in the U.S. for lots of religions to spring up. And in a lot of places, it would have been essentially impossible for something like Mormonism to spring up because it would have been violently put down by the state, right? It would have actually been kind of actively suppressed. And the US isn't like that. Now, the majority of people in the United States have been Christian, but it's never been a state monopoly, right? You could be Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Sikh or Mormon or anything else in the US, and that's essentially constitutionally protected. So yeah, and Christianity in the US has a lot of variations, right? You have everything from really old world like Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Anglicanism, all the way to very modern evangelical kind of ways of practicing Christianity. So, so it's not really a religious monopoly in the US. It's a religious free market. Even though it seems like one religion dominates, that religion is very segmented, right? Okay. Are children who grow up religious more likely to change their religion, become atheists? How does upbringing affect religious demand? This is a really complicated question. It really depends on a lot of factors. Parental religiosity plays a tremendous role. Depending on how religious your parents are is going to depend, it's going to affect a lot how likely you are to move away from religion. Moderately religious and somewhat irreligious parents are much more likely to have irreligious children, children who grow up to be irreligious. If your parents are very religious, again, there are exceptions, but most likely you're going to end up on some spectrum of religion. There are also some religions that are more and less effective at keeping their people. Like older forms of Protestantism, what we call the mainline, are relatively inefficient. They retain about somewhere between 55 and 60% of their young people. Evangelicals are considerably more efficient. It's about 3/4 of people who grow up evangelical still identify as evangelical as adults. It really depends on the religious group you're talking about. You can come take either my Sociology of Youth and Religion, CHRTC 309, offered online asynchronously in the fall, or Sociology 376, offered in person in the winter. That's Sociology of Religion, and I got a ton more information on both those questions in there. And I feel my voice is slightly dying. Okay, did I I got everything. Okay. Oy. Some terminology from Stark and the way he thinks about how this works. Now, I will say, I do find sometimes some of this, the language that's used here is a little bit Eurocentric, in that, it identifies broad religious organizations as, within kind of Christian language, but I can't do anything about that. That's the terms that are used in sociology. So a church is any bureaucratic religious organization that has fully accommodated itself to mainstream society and culture, right? So any kind of big bureaucratic religious organization that's operating within kind of mainstream society with very little trouble. I see we're all coughing and dying today. That's okay. So like, your synagogue, if you're Jewish, right, and you're, at like B'nai B'rith, that would technically be a church according to this taxonomy, as would, a mosque, or a large kind of grouping of mosques in Islam, right? So those would all be churches. Sects are usually, breakaway groups from larger religious organizations, right, from churches, generally those that are less integrated into society, and kind of split away, right? So when if you're driving around Edmonton ever, right, and you happen to notice, right, like in a strip mall, there's like Church of the Living God or something like that. I think that's the one I drive past every day on my way to drop my daughter off at school. It's just like in a strip mall next to like I swear, like a warehouse that sells nuts and bolts. All right, this is probably a religious sect, right? They've split off from a bigger religious group, and they usually have some complaint, right, that the church that they split off from wasn't doing things traditionally enough, or was interpreting whatever religious book they have incorrectly. So a denomination kind of midway between, a sect and a church. So they're generally, how do we explain this? So they're not like a breakaway group with like radical ideas of like returning to purity or anything. They've kind of moved beyond that, and they're now sort of moving in the direction of becoming a more established bureaucratic organization. So they're kind of in between a church and a sect. And then the one everybody always wants to talk about is the new religious movements, again, sometimes referred to as cults, colloquially. Groups typically headed by charismatic leaders with a unique religious vision that requires, rejection of mainstream culture and society. And most of the time, right, new religious movements have a couple of paths. Either they survive and they become, religions on their own, or they fade away and they die, right? Those are the two paths we typically see with new religious movements. Okay. Oh, right, I had that on the next slide. Silly me. Right, new religious movements, 3 outcomes. They might disappear, they might become more church-like, and eventually they might become institutionalized, right? So most of them disappear really quickly, right? And like I said, usually between 5 and 40 years. What usually happens is the founder, right, that our charismatic leader, has made some kind of pronouncement, right? Like God is going to return and, in this place on this day, and, we're all going to be transported to Blistonia, a planet known for its high levels of bliss. So when that doesn't happen, right, people get disillusioned. Usually the first group of people that join the new religious movement get tired and they leave, and then the new religious movement collapses. And this is probably something in the range of like 95% of new religious movements do not make it beyond the 40-year mark, right? Relatively rare. The group persists and becomes more church-like. You can think of this probably, and again, no desire to offend anyone, but if you think of the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Jehovah's Witnesses very much start as a new religious movement. As they've proceeded and as they've gotten older, right, they've become more church-like, right? They've started to resemble that body more. You can think here too, like Seventh-day Adventists. Again, they kind of started with that their founder saying, God's going to come back on this date and this time. Let's all hang out in a field. That didn't happen. He's like, I got the math wrong. It's actually going to be on this date, on this date. God still didn't show up on that date at that time in that place. And then they kind of dropped that whole thing. And I can't remember what it was like. Well, actually, it was a spiritual reclaiming of people that happened on that date, not a physical one. And then it proceeded to become more like, just a church, right? It became more church-like. If they go long enough, they'll become like the Seventh-day Adventists. They become institutionalized, they get an institutional sort of structure, leadership, ways that they manage power and money, and eventually they become, just part of the religious landscape. Okay, so, all right, the market theory of religion, right? It's a good theory, and I would say, probably, I would say somewhere in the range, and this is not an exact number, 70% of like contemporary sociologists of religion ascribe to some aspect of the market theory. It's a very successful theory, and one of the things it's succeeded in explaining is why the US remains particularly religious. But it does have certain problems. It works pretty well in a Western context, right? And it works well to explain the United States and Europe, right? Europe had religious monopolies. Europe became irreligious and was potentially irreligious, for a long time, like even before we typically think of, declines in religion starting. The US was relatively a free market, and it's becoming more religious over time. Other places, though, we don't see, it doesn't explain as well. So if we look at a lot of Muslim countries, right, places like, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, there's a near monopoly in religion in those places. But if anything, religious observance is really widespread. And in a lot of ways, despite not really facing competition from outside religious forces, Islamic countries have been becoming more Islamic over time, like really since the 1980s, right? There's been a tremendous revival in Muslim belief. Now, I think there are ways to fit this into the market theory, because I think when you look below the surface, a lot of Muslim countries are very segmented, right? They have different kind of preachers and imams, that offer slightly different messages at slightly different intensities, and people find those more and less appealing. So I think there's more competition in the market than we tend to think. Maybe from a Western perspective, we view Islam as like this, monolithic thing, but actually there's a lot of differentiation within Islam as well. Okay, and yeah, like the sort of increase in, both in Islam and Hinduism, they're really recent phenomenon, and in some ways sort of responses to colonization and Western power and the spread of Western beliefs and values in some ways. So they might be operating on somewhat different principles. And Canada throws a bit of a wrench into into the market model, because Canada's kind of weird. So Canada, if we go back to like 1950, technically speaking, Canada was more religious than the United States, right? Higher percentage of adherence and more religiosity. And Canada, as it's become, gone through the latter half of the 20th century, religiosity in a lot of ways is collapsing faster than the US. And Canada, kind of sits where Europe is at the low ebb of religion in lots of ways. Canada's kind of in the middle, and the US is, in terms of industrialized modern countries, the US is very much kind of on top, right? So Canada kind of sits in an awkward place. We're secularizing more quickly than the United States. We're not quite as secular as Europe in a lot of ways. So we're in kind of an uneasy place, but we have a very unregulated religious market as well. And the dynamics of what's caused Canada to be less religious are quite complex, right? And a little bit hard to explain. Okay. So, yeah, the future of religion, always kind of a crapshoot to declare. By the year 2100, the world is going to be about as religious as it is today. If we look at kind of global estimates, Christianity will still be about a third of the global population. Islam will roughly catch up to Christianity to make up about a third of the global population. In secular people, or in people who consider themselves non-religious, are going to decline a little bit because they, if current trends continue, which they never do. But secular people, right, people who consider themselves non-religious, have significantly fewer children than religious people, and where secularism is concentrated is mostly in the West, and those are societies that have and places like Japan, and these are places that have rapidly declining populations, and that population decline is going to continue apace unless something changes, which it might. Elon Musk is telling us we need to have more babies, so it's probably going to happen, right? I say that as a joke. No one should listen to Elon Musk. He likes to have children, but not raise them. He just has children with random women. It's kind of gross. He's kind of a weird dude. Okay, so yeah, we may see increasing secularization, especially in the West. Globally, we're probably going to see the world becoming more religious and probably more frequent with religious conflicts, especially between Christians and Muslims, as the two kind of run into each other, where they're both growing pretty robustly in places like sub-Saharan Africa. Okay. Okay, religious affiliation in Canada. I'll talk about this really quickly, and I'll show you some very up-to-date numbers. The Europeans who first came to Canada were mostly Christian, right? English-speaking Protestants, French-speaking Roman Catholics. Jewish people start arriving in the 18th century, and we get Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, and Buddhists arriving more in the 20th century. We get some Buddhists in the 19th century coming from Japan and China, but it's not a large number. Okay. What do Jehovah's Witnesses believe in? Oh, I cannot answer this question because A, I don't remember everything they believe in. Amongst other things, they believe that every other group of Christians uses the wrong name for God. They think God's true name is Jehovah. It's really gets down in some cases to the really absurdly, theological, but it doesn't matter. They also believe no blood transfusions, but I don't want to get into, everything having to do with Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay. Can the revival of Islam be more tied to events like the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, dissolution of the Caliphate, and Western imperialism? I tend to put it, the Ottoman Empire, sure. Although the revival of Islam, doesn't happen until 60 years after really the Ottoman collapse. And even like Turkey, right? Modern day Turkey, in a lot of ways is going through its own kind of Islamic revival after the sort of Ataturk secularization that happened in Turkey has kind of, in some ways, run aground. Like the whole goal, in some senses, of the secularization of Turkey was for it to join Europe. Right, and as the Europeans have been like, yeah, actually, we don't like the Turkish that much, and we really don't want the Turkish to join the European Union. It sort of caused a backlash and in some cases, a re-Islamicization of parts of Turkish society, and certainly, what's-his-face, Erdogan, the Turkish president, is very much kind of a Muslim extremist. I think Western imperialism and a pushback against Western imperialism probably explains a lot of the kind of rise of Islam. But I'm sure it's more complicated than that as well. Saudi Arabia's hatred for Iran come from different religious sects only. Yes, but also they're geostrategic rivals, right? They're between the Turks, the Saudis, and the Iranians. They're all big, powerful, populist Islamist countries that are trying to dominate the Middle East, right? And they're always all competing with each other for kind of power and control over that region. So there's lots of things, right? They all don't like each other. 2047 Holy War when? Well, 2047. You just said it. Okay. All right, we'll take a look at some kind of basic numbers, right? Actually, do I have all this on the? I do kind of have these numbers on the next slide, so I'll just skip over here. If we look at Canada, right? Oh, do I have? Oh, I don't have the 2001 numbers. All right, so Canada, if we go back to 2001, right, when I was an undergrad, the country was about 43% Roman Catholic, 30% Protestant, and 16% no religious affiliation, with some change at the bottom. Today, right, or in 2011, number of Catholics had declined to a little less than 40%. Protestants had dropped 1%, and the non-religious, right, this is the big difference, had grown to about a quarter of the population. If we fast forward to 2021, right, when we have the most recent census data, Catholics are now down to about 29%, a little over 30%, a little under 30%, sorry. Protestants as a whole, right, this one has split them up, but they've all been going down like a stone, except for other Christian, which are evangelicals. Evangelicals growing at a decent rate, and other religions have kind of been growing, but the biggest growth has been from, about a quarter to a little over a third of people, a little over a third of Canadians identifying with no religion, right, as non-religious, right? And you can see it on this chart. Right, Christianity starts in 2001, up past the 70% range, and it's declining, and it's now just above 50% of people in Canada identify as Christian, and it's declining pretty rapidly. No religion and secular perspectives, right? So atheist and agnostic has grown pretty robustly at the same time, and other religions, especially Hindu and Muslim, have grown pretty robustly, driven principally by immigration. Yeah, and in 2021, about 5% of the Canadian population was Muslim. So, all right, and then some fun facts. I will say I stole all of this from Sarah Wilkins Laflamme's Twitter. Her fault for putting it up there. Just the trend lines. What was once the largest Protestant church in Canada in 1971. At 18% of Canadians, today is about 3%. Catholics have taken a pretty hard hit too, a 16% decline since 1971. Muslims are growing, 7% of Ontarians identify as Muslim. Sikhs, also growing. 5.9% of British Columbia identifies as Sikh. And, Hindus, 4% of people in Ontario say they're Hindu, which is the high point for Hinduism in Canada, right? So these are all driven by immigration, principally. I mean, all of these groups do have more children than these two or any other group in Canada. So there is fertility and immigration kind of driving those. But Canada's religious landscape is going to continue changing as things go. Jehovah's Witnesses are your least, at least you have a list. Least favorite new religious movement. You see other absurdly boring groups like Heaven's Gates went out with a bang. No, don't memorize these. I won't ask you questions on the stats. I put it in there to give you a sense of the religious landscape because I think it's fun and cool, and I'm a religion nerd, so we go, as it goes. Well, if I ever start my own new religious movement, I will make sure that it goes out with a bang so that it makes you happy. Okay. How much time do we have left? We have 40 minutes. So hang on, I'm going to pull up, I have my other slides here for education. I think we have just enough time to maybe get through education between today and Thursday. So we're gonna hit hard on that. Just make sure the live stream is still working. The live stream has lost its video. Okay, fixie. We're going to try to pack in one more unit. I know you're all thrilled. Okay, we're going to do our education unit. We're going to kind of go from there. Okay, so we're going to talk education as our last unit. I should really have put education first and then religion last, since it's like my favorite. All right, I'm going to have one more honey lozenge to try and get my throat through the last 40 minutes here. Okay, so same slide as before. let you out early. No, the university frowns on that. Mormons, the list is Mormons, People's Temple, Scientology. Wow, you do have quite the list. Good for you. Anthill kids after the Anthill kids. Okay. All right. Good times. All right. So we talk about education, right? What does education do in a modern society? So schools, right? At least, if we want to talk about their manifest function, right? The thing they're supposed to do, they're supposed to endow our young people with key capacities like communication, right? Reading and writing, coordination, basic organizational skills, and the ability to be economically productive, right? So you give them your reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? And they become good economic agents. So, and they accomplish kind of two main tasks. Creating homogeny out of diversity by giving everybody uniform curriculum. And they sort students into paths that terminate in different social classes, right? Now, Canada's education system doesn't do this as much as some other ones, like the German education system, tracks you from very, very young into either an academic or a practical path. But basically, right, the fact that some people end up in university, some people end up in trade schools, right, this is part of education's purpose to kind of sort people into those different paths, which end in different social classes, right? Either the working class, the middle class, or obviously, if we talk about elite institutions, the kind of upper classes. Now, this point is kind of, interesting, the kind of uniform curriculum and the homogenization that education causes. One of the reasons that a lot of people wanted to bring in public education at the beginning was specifically to unify populations, especially around national stories, right? Around national identities and kind of shared narratives. So if we go back in time, right, to when, say, Alberta and Saskatchewan were being made provinces out of the Northwest Territories, one of the big debates was whether they would be allowed to keep their Catholic schools or whether they would have to be like a lot of the other provinces and have only public schools, right? The federal government did not want Catholic schools in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but eventually the province, the people trying to create the provinces sort of won. What the federal government wanted, that's my voice, was, a homogenous Canadian identity, which was much more Protestant in its kind of origins, and not Catholic, right? So there's always been a kind of unifying, form. The idea is everybody comes out with the same values and morals out of the school system. And or the education system today has taken over and displaced religion as the main purveyor of formal knowledge. And it's only secondary to the family as an agent of socialization, right? So we talk about secondary socialization, right? If we go back to our socialization unit from earlier in the course, right? Schools do most of the secondary socialization because it's where kids will spend most of their time. And it is a relatively recent phenomenon, really tracing back to the 19th century and really, limited to, developed and fairly developed countries. Okay. So the history, if we go back 300 years, right, most people were illiterate. All right, the vast majority of people never attended school. The vast majority of people couldn't read and write. They lived their lives without that. About 100 years ago, right, so if we go back, to the beginning part of the 20th century, most people never, globally, most people never attended school at all. By 1950, about 10% of the world's countries had compulsory mass education. So this would have been most of your countries in Western Europe, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and then, Central Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union would have had compulsory mass education. Today, even in some places, parts of sub-Saharan Africa especially, and Southeast Asia, they still have relatively low, by global standards, literacy rates, below 50%. Canada, though, is one where we have a lot invested in education. over 15,500 elementary schools, or elementary and secondary schools, employing 300,000 or more educators who teach more than 5 million kids a year, and millions of people a year enrolled in universities and colleges. So, yeah, 64% by 2012 of people between ages 25 and 64 had at least some post-secondary education, whether it be, a technical degree, right, from somewhere like NAIT, a trade, a 2-year program at somewhere, like where we used to have community colleges that gave 2-year certificates, or a 4-year undergraduate degree. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, that. They're a subcult of a cult, let's say. Okay. Amusing. Okay. So, I love this picture, right? Come away from the window. You don't want to be left behind, do you, child? Right, she's looking at the real world while everybody else is plugged in and has blinders on. Okay, so the goal of mass education, right? Part of it is create, uniform socialization. Everybody gets a similar level of socialization and education offered by the state or state actors. So you had to do this, you had to create a system of education with sufficient resources to include all children, right? And this was a huge social change, and it took a really, really long time. The push for mass education, starts, you can argue like in 1668, Presbyterians in Scotland were saying we need compulsory mass education in Scotland, but it really doesn't find its real beginnings until kind of the middle part of the 19th century, as industrialization is rolling and factories are finding they need more skilled workers. You start to get the push for, at least basic schooling for everybody. And over time it expands and expands and it gets longer and longer, right? So that today you have to stay in school until you're at least 16 years old. But it takes a really long time to roll out, and it's probably not kind of fully rolled out until kind of the 1960s, 1960s, maybe the 1970s, where you really get, like, say, the high school diploma being the core asset that people have that they can use to get a job. Again, I'm getting old now, but if I go back to just my grandparents' generation, right, so, 2 generations back from me, neither of my grandparents on my mom's side finished school. My grandfather, again, he was born in the 19th century, went up to grade 6, and my grandmother, went all the way to grade 11 before she got married and then pregnant and then dropped out. It's a different time. Very, very different time. But by the time you get to like my parents' generation, compulsory schooling, at least to the end of high school, and they both graduated in the 60s. Actually, sorry, my mom graduated in the 70s. From high school, right, had become the norm and expected basically for everybody. Okay, so replacing the family and religion with a centralized, rationalized system, it has definitely created a strong pressure towards uniformity and standardization. Okay, we talk about education in kind of sociological terms. We typically talk about 2 things. So, educational achievement, the learning or skill that individuals acquire, which is reflected in the grades that they get, or educational attainment, which we typically talk about in terms of degrees, years completed, and those sorts of things. Now, attainment tends to be a little bit easier to measure sociologically than achievement, right? Because it's really easy to track on, say, surveys, what's your highest level of education achieved or attained, right? So you can be like, oh, is it usually less than, high school or less, post-second or trade, or trade, 2-year certificate, 4-year bachelor's degree, right? master's, PhD, or whatever, right? So this is typically how we measure things. Achievement's a little bit more difficult, especially because sometimes people get through, levels or certificates without necessarily mastering the skills involved. Okay. So, higher educational, it's that time of year, folks. Higher educational attainment typically has been one of the most effective tools that we have for increasing people's economic attainment as well, right? So employment and higher earnings. The more education you get, the more likely you are to do well economically, right? So it's changed a little bit over time, but what you see, right, is these lines up here, right? This is your above a bachelor's degree, that's blue. Where's the red? Bachelor's degree, red, and college or cégep, that's a, Quebec thing. You see basically all of these kind of, in terms of employment rate, you're sitting above 70%, right? So people who have these sorts of degrees, above 70% employment. When you look at, high school graduate or trade certificates, we do see, kind of at their peak in 2004, about 65% of them had a job. I'm going to turn that microphone down just a little bit because I'm hearing a lot of feedback. Boop, boop, boop. Okay. Going down, but still, your worst place to be, I'm going to erase my scribbles. Your worst place to be is really the high school graduate, right? Less education means the lowest kind of employment rate on this chart. So more employment, higher earnings, right? If we had an earnings chart, what you see is typically, it's sort of like the lowest is people with a high school or less. Trades are somewhere kind of in the middle. Bachelor's degree is a little bit higher than that. I guess it depends on the trade, but on average, trades are a little bit lower than that. Bachelor's degree, and then masters, and then PhDs actually don't go up that high beyond a master's, right? They're about equal. So typically, at least a bachelor's degree is going to get you to kind of a really happy spot in terms of earnings. Enhances earning prospects. There are exceptions, of course, but generally more education and better earnings tend to go together. Okay. Oh, and you can see this, right? High school, if you look at this chart, this is from Ontario in 2011. High school diploma or equivalent, on average, about $38,808. Sorry, that's Canada. Ontario's in blue. $38,808, right? Far lower than a university degree, right? Which is not quite double, but pretty close to double the average earnings for someone with just a high school diploma, right? And in the middle there, right, post-secondary certificate below a bachelor's level, you're still talking about, slightly higher than your high school certificate, but you really see your best, improvements when you get to this level. So stay in school. Your video's off center. No. It got off centered somehow. Fixie. I think that'll work. I don't know why that happens sometimes. Okay. All fixed, sort of. Schools do kind of push a lot on kids at a young age. Sure they do. Everybody needs to share everything. Okay. So, 4 kind of big historical events that led to the rise of mass education and mass schooling. The first one is the invention of the printing press. So this happens in 1440. It's an absolutely hilarious story about a guy who decides to create a bunch of Bibles to sell at a religious fair, gets the date of the religious fair wrong, goes bankrupt, and his creditors seize the printing press and are like, this thing's really cool, we should make more of them, and they do. And suddenly there's books all over Europe. So the printing press is the technology that enables the spread of literacy and creates an environment where literacy and print take over from an oral culture in Europe, to become the sort of dominant means of communication and allow knowledge to build in much more concerted ways for cheaper. All right, the rise of Protestantism, not that long after the printing press, right? We get the Protestant Reformation in 1517, or the beginnings of it in 1517. On Halloween, October 31st, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the cathedral door in Wittenberg and accidentally kicks off the Protestant Reformation, splits Christianity into two, well, Western Christianity, into two major camps, the Protestants and the Catholics. And the Protestants, as a funny kind of thing that they do, encourage to read the Bible and interpret it for themselves, which means they all have to be taught to read. And very early, people like Luther, Martin Luther, and John Calvin encourage parents to teach their children to read so that they can be good Protestants. All right. The rise of democracy in the 18th century, right? The idea, right? We get our first democratic revolution in 1776 in the U.S. and then in 1786 in France. That one doesn't last as long, but you get first the American Revolution and then the French Revolutions, right? Which kick off, the transition from autocracies and monarchies to democracy. And one of the principles of democracy is that, you need informed citizens, and the only way to get informed citizens is to educate them, right? So it kicks off another push for increases in education. And then industrialization, this one, Marxists have long argued is critical. Mass education becomes necessary for creating an industrial economy because you need literate workers, right? And especially you start to need a literate management class that can operate your factories for you as industrialization and industrial economies get too big. Okay, so like I said on the last slide, the most important reason for, I looked up. He distracted me by leaving, and I scribbled on my own words, right? The most important reason for the rise of mass schooling is in fact industrialization. Again, this is a very kind of conflict theory view, but it makes sense. You need, for a highly productive economy, you need an education system to create a large mass labor force that's able to do relatively complex tasks and read instructions. You need a management class that can, operate far-flung factories with written orders and all of these things. So, the other thing, industrial societies become very rich, right? Industrial societies grow really, really quickly. They develop a lot of excess wealth, and that excess wealth allows the state, to train and employ, teachers to create this system. Industrial economies need a lot of smart people to keep improving the technologies, so education becomes an important goal. And today, basically, it's kind of widely acknowledged that investment in education is an important step to national wealth, and especially like countries that aren't, if we want to go back to our globalization thing, in terms of like modernization theory, right, that kind of functionalist theory of globalization, one of the things that modernization theorists will stress is that underdeveloped economies need a mass education system in order to educate workers, to have enough educated workers to basically, run an industrial economy. So, education is not only the source of wealth, it is also a product of wealth. Bless you. Okay. All right. So, the functions of education. So what does education do? Man, my voice. Holy moly. All right, I need more water. So education, we know its manifest functions, right? What it is supposed to do. It is supposed to educate people, right? To create skilled workers, to impart shared values, and all of that fun stuff. It also, however, has a bunch of what you would call latent or unintended functions. So one of them is creating a concerted youth culture. Why? Well, because you stick a bunch of young people together in a single place, right? They start to, suddenly you have more young people and they outnumber, say, teachers or instructors, largely, they will create their kind of own culture. So what we get out of schooling is all of these youth cultures with their own lingos and languages, right, that come from grouping young people together and having them spend a lot of time together. I think we talked about this earlier in the course. Schools and things like universities create, marriage markets, right, or mating markets, where people meet future romantic partners that typically come from the same social strata as they do, right? And this is called assortative mating, right? So you basically put people of the same kind of class, race, religion together in similar schools typically, and then they meet and marry people that are similar to them. This is held true really until the advent of dating apps. Have screwed up the mating market in really interesting and fun ways, which you can learn more about in my class, Sociology of Youth, if you're looking for something to take next year. We'll talk about dating apps and how they've messed up the mating market. They create, custodial and surveillance systems for children, right? Part of the thing that schools do is parents put their kids there and they know their kids are safe and cared for and being taught while they go to work, right? So it's a custodial system for children. It's not meant to be that, but it creates that at the end of the day. It creates a means of maintaining wage levels, right? By sorting people into different social classes, and occasionally creates, counterculture movements. We see this especially in the 1970s with the kind of anti-war Vietnam movement that largely came out of the kind of youth cultures of the time. Okay. I was just wondering. Okay, sorry, seeing where we're at here. How many slides do I have left? I don't want to burn through too much. Lots. Don't worry, we'll get through it all. So, manifest functions. What is it supposed to do, right? So, social institutions must perform certain common, manifest, or intended functions, right? You should know this. Talked about this earlier in the course. So, the manifest functions of education, right? We need, in industrial societies, widespread application of science, technology, and the economy, and we need people who can work that. And the education system works to create those people, right? So it aims at educating people, giving them the skills to function in our economies, and it has a bunch of manifest functions as well, right? Things like creating solidarity through cultural homogeneity, right? You all go to school, you all learn the same songs, right? You all learn the same things, learn the same history. You learn, I guess in Alberta, maybe you learn a different history. I don't know. The UCP does funny things with the social studies curriculum. You learn this, at least in theory, the same history, the same literature. It's supposed to create a kind of common culture, something that you all sort of share, right? One of the reasons that you still have to read Shakespeare in high school is because it's trying to give you a sense of a common culture that you all kind of share. Also, Shakespeare is awesome. So, schools also transmit shared knowledge and culture between generations, right? So a common cultural identity, even things like teaching you all the national anthem, right? Having you go through things like Remembrance Day celebrations gives us these kind of sense of shared kind of cultural identity within a country. Okay. This system, right? The uniformity that industrial work requires an education system that teaches workers kind of common standards, right? We want basically people to come out of kind of the school system with common sets of abilities, right? At least basic standards of abilities. So this used to, look like a system that, system had to be created. Oh, what does this say? Oh, so yeah, the way that this was done, it created historically was basically they took people out, they found people, a privileged few were recruited out of elite institutions, socialized to the new standards and then sent back to the peripheral regions to impose these uniform standards, right? So if you ever look at like, I don't know, a show set in like the Wild West or colonial kind of Canada, right? There's this really cheesy one that was on Hallmark for a long time called When Calls the Heart, which was a weird, my wife really loved it. I thought it was cringe, but she made me watch it anyway. Because that's how marriage works. Sometimes you have to watch the cringy Hallmark shows with your wife. And make comments about her in class. That's part of the marriage bargain. But right, the main character in that show is this woman from Hamilton, right? And she goes to teachers college. She's taught how to be a teacher, and then she's sent off to like a small community in the prairies to educate the people there and pass on that uniform standard, right? And that's kind of how it worked historically, right? And again, this is kind of how we do it now. You want to be a teacher, right? So we recruit you, we bring you to university, we educate you in the common standards, and then we send you off, to elementary schools to pass on those standards to our students. And this is how common school standards kind of work. Okay. Marx is your goat. I too love people who inspire genocide. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Another one here, another thing that schools do is inspire national solidarity. So, one of the other things that public education has done, right, is try to transmit a set of shared cultural beliefs. So, not for nothing, right, education emerges around the same time as we're getting the formation of really large, really powerful nation states, right? Things like Canada, the United States, modern France, right, the French republics, the United Kingdom, that come to replace sort of feudal kingdoms, right, that were often, multi-ethnic, ruled by, kings and other things. These are replaced, starting in the kind of 18th and 19th centuries by increasingly big and powerful nation states. And public education, right, was basically a tool that these nation states used to promote kind of membership in a national community, right? To tell everyone from, Vancouver to St. John, Newfoundland, the common story that you are Canadian, right? That you, and being Canadian, you have these kind of shared values, this shared history. This is who you are. Benedict Anderson talks about this, in terms of nation states being imagined communities. Basically, like, if you think about it, you have very little in common with someone in Vancouver, and you have even less probably in common with someone who lives in like rural Chicoutimi, right? That's in Quebec. And yet you all think of yourselves as Canadian in some sense because you're part of a sort of imagined community that is Canada. Schools are kind of key to communicating that because they tell us the shared history, the shared stories, teach us the anthems, celebrate when hockey teams win, right? And all of that kind of stuff. And they help inculcate, the values, of a country that's mostly strangers into a kind of shared collection of people that share, at least an imagined connection to each other. Okay, 10 more minutes. Let's see what we can do. Okay. So let's talk, let's talk a conflict theory perspective. So, again, if we go back to kind of race, our unit on race that we did a little while ago, we talked a little bit about meritocracy, right? Meritocracy is one of the core principles of our education system. Basically, the idea is that whoever gets the best grades will be rewarded basically by getting the best opportunities, right? So you get the best grades in high school, you're going to get access to the best programs in university, you're going to get access to scholarships, and all of that stuff, right? Conflict theorists have said, yeah, this is the basis of a lot of education theory, that we're going to reward the best students with the most opportunities based on ability. Now, what they say, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about race, that this idea, that rank corresponds to individual capacities is often problematic, because my voice keeps cracking. It's often problematic because the education system and subsequent social ranking are often are not necessarily based on individual merit, but actually based on privilege, right? That certain groups are privileged, right? And especially if you get into sort of, conflict theory takes on race, that things like race matter, like white people are more privileged in the system than people of, BIPOC people or people of color, because they are given sort of higher standing in the system, and that not everybody starts from, the same place. And I have this nice little graphic for meritocracy, right? Jim has an IQ of 150, as does Sang, but Jim has all of these advantages, right? Enrichment programs, tutoring, the best books you can buy, latest IT tools, and whatever this is. And all Sang has is a basic education because his parents can afford less, and Jim is way closer to success. And this is sort of the conflict theory perspective, right? Is that the ruling classes perpetuate their own privilege by basically ensuring that the system rewards them and their children already have a step up. Okay, so a lot of things here can get in the way, right? So things like the cost of higher education. Right, higher education in Canada requires students and their families to shoulder significant financial burdens. Right? You've been paying for this, for at least a year now, so you know what it costs to get an education in Canada, right? Not everybody is able to do this, right? Tuition fees, residence fees, all this stuff, costs, right? Transportation to campus. And social origin, can strongly affect how much education people get. Sometimes this is called, what is it called? The intergenerational transfer of advantage. Transfer of advantage. I'm just going to write transfer. Right? If your parents went to university, they likely have better jobs, they earn more, they have more resources. You yourself will get that advantage transferred, right? It's something like if one of your parents went to, completed university, you have about a 50-50 shot of, a little bit over 50-50 shot of going to university and completing it yourself. If both your parents went to university, it's about 75% chance that you will attend and complete university. If neither of your parents went to university, it's about a 30% shot that you will go to and complete university, right? So having, been advantaged tends to help people in the long run. Okay, I hear the shifting in chairs. We'll do one more slide and then I'll let you go. Okay, so social exclusion, right? Basically, conflict theory scholars will say that social exclusions are done in a capitalist system in particular by creating barriers that so that certain social opportunities and positions are simply not open to everybody, right? So things like post-secondary, if we make it expensive enough and hard enough to get into, only people from richer kind of middle class and upper class families will be able to get there, which means you're kind of, your working class and your poor are going to be perpetually kind of stuck outside of the sort of middle and upper classes that control a lot of social policy. So, I have the intergenerational transfer advantage on this slide, right? Intergenerational transfer of advantage, is a way of kind of controlling this. If you come from parents that went to university, you're more likely to go to university, and that perpetuates this kind of class divide. And if anything, the class divide is getting wider over time. Okay, 4 minutes left, but let's leave it there. I hear the uncomfortable shifting. We will definitely get through all of this. What remains, the 12 slides that remain, we'll power through it on Thursday, and then we'll be done the course, and I will have accomplished everything I promised to accomplish, and we'll go from there.